Captain Sarah Mitchell stood at the gate of Terminal C, her leather flight bag slung over her shoulder, watching the steady stream of passengers board Flight 447 to Denver. The familiar weight of her captain's stripes felt heavier today, not from the gold braiding itself, but from the invisible burden of proving herself yet again. At 34, she had logged over 8,000 flight hours, earned her airline transport pilot license with distinction, and commanded respect from every crew she'd ever flown with. Yet here she was, facing the same skeptical glances and hushed whispers that had followed her throughout her career. The morning had started like any other until she arrived at the crew briefing room. First Officer James Rodriguez, a seasoned pilot with 15 years of experience, had greeted her with the usual professional courtesy. But when Captain Thompson, the chief pilot on duty, entered the room, his expression shifted from neutral to something approaching disbelief. His eyes swept over Sarah's uniform, lingering on her captain's bars with an expression that suggested he was looking at an elaborate costume rather than the earned insignia of a qualified airline captain. "Mitchell," Thompson had said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority, "there's been a change of plans. We're reassigning you to first officer on this flight. Captain Rodriguez will take command." The words had hit her like turbulence at 30,000 feet, sudden and jarring. Rodriguez himself had looked uncomfortable, his dark eyes darting between Sarah and Thompson with obvious unease. "Sir, with respect," Sarah had replied, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. "I'm scheduled as captain on this flight. My qualifications are current, my medical is valid, and I've flown this route 47 times in the past year." She had kept her tone professional, but there was steel underneath. Years of facing similar challenges had taught her that emotion, however justified, would only be used against her. Thompson's response had been delivered with the casual dismissiveness that Sarah had encountered too many times to count. "The passengers expect a certain level of experience in the cockpit. This is a full flight, whether conditions are marginal, and frankly, some of our more senior passengers have expressed concerns about flying with female pilots. It's nothing personal, Mitchell. It's just business." The words hung in the air like smoke from a crash site. Rodriguez had shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening. Sarah knew he was caught between loyalty to a fellow pilot and the pressure from above. She had faced this exact scenario 17 times in her career, each instance chipping away at her confidence like ice forming on wings, dangerous and persistent. But today felt different. Today, Sarah's fingers instinctively moved to the small patch sewn onto the inside of her flight jacket, hidden from casual view but close enough to her heart that she could feel its slight texture through the fabric. The patch bore a simple but powerful image, a silver aircraft silhouette against a dark blue background, with 4 small gold stars arranged beneath it. To most people, it would look like just another aviation patch, perhaps commemorating a milestone or achievement. But Sarah knew its true significance. And more importantly, she knew that when the moment was right, this patch would speak louder than all the doubts, whispers, and institutional barriers that had tried to ground her dreams. The patch represented something that went far beyond her individual struggle as a female pilot in a male-dominated industry. It carried with it a story of courage, sacrifice, and heroism that transcended gender, rank, or any other artificial barrier that small minds might construct. Sarah had earned the right to wear this patch through circumstances that no amount of flight simulator training could prepare anyone for. Circumstances that had tested not just her technical skills, but her character, her resolve, and her ability to make split-second decisions when lives hung in the balance. As she stood there in the briefing room, facing Thompson's dismissive attitude and Rodriguez's uncomfortable silence, Sarah made a decision. She wouldn't fight this battle with words or appeals to policy manuals. Instead, she would let her actions speak, and when the time was right, she would reveal the story behind the patch that she wore not as decoration, but as a reminder of who she really was beneath the uniform, beyond the stereotypes, and above the limitations that others tried to impose on her. The morning sun streaming through the terminal windows caught the reflection in Sarah's aviator sunglasses as she walked toward the gate, her spine straight, her pace measured and confident. She had no idea that within the next few hours, the small patch hidden in her jacket would become the key to unlocking not just her rightful place in the cockpit, but the respect and recognition that she had been fighting for throughout her entire career. The passengers boarding Flight 447 saw only another pilot in uniform, but they were about to witness something extraordinary, something that would change their assumptions about courage, competence, and what it truly means to have the right stuff. 2 hours into the flight, as Flight 447 cruised smoothly at 37,000 feet over the Colorado Rockies, Sarah sat in the first officer's seat, her hands moving efficiently across the instrument panel during the routine systems check. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was doing the same job she would have done as captain, but with half the authority and none of the recognition. Captain Rodriguez had been respectful throughout the flight, even deferential at times, clearly uncomfortable with the circumstances that had placed him in command over a more experienced pilot. The cabin was peaceful, filled with the steady hum of engines and the quiet conversations of passengers settling in for the remainder of their journey to Denver. Flight attendant Maria Santos had just finished the beverage service and was securing the galley when the first unusual reading appeared on Sarah's instruments. She noticed it immediately, a slight fluctuation in the number 2 engine's oil pressure that was subtle enough to be within normal parameters but persistent enough to warrant attention. "Rodriguez," she said quietly, her voice carrying the calm professionalism that marked experienced aviators, "I'm seeing some irregularities in engine 2. Oil pressure is dancing between normal and low normal range." She pointed to the digital display, where the numbers flickered almost imperceptibly. "It's probably nothing, but I'd like to keep an eye on it." Rodriguez leaned over to examine the readings, his brow furrowing with concentration. "You're right. It's subtle, but it's there." He appreciated Sarah's keen eye. Many pilots might have missed such a minor variation. "Let's monitor it closely. If it drops below minimum parameters, we'll need to consider our options." What neither pilot could have known was that 2,000 feet below them, retired Air Force Colonel Marcus Webb was settling into his first-class seat, unaware that his presence on this flight would soon transform everything. Webb, now 73 years old with silver hair and laugh lines earned through decades of service, was traveling to Denver for his granddaughter's graduation from the Air Force Academy. He had spent the morning reviewing the ceremony program, his chest swelling with pride at the thought of another Webb earning their wings. Webb had commanded fighter squadrons, served as a test pilot, and in his final years of service had been instrumental in some of the Air Force's most classified rescue operations. His keen military bearing was softened now by retirement, but his sharp eyes still missed nothing. He had noticed the female pilot during boarding, not with the skepticism that some passengers displayed, but with the professional interest of someone who had worked alongside exceptional aviators of all backgrounds throughout his career. The first sign of real trouble came 30 minutes later when the oil pressure in engine 2 didn't just fluctuate. It began a steady, unmistakable decline. Sarah's training kicked in immediately as she watched the digital readout drop from the green range into the amber caution zone. "Rodriguez, we have a problem," she said, her voice maintaining its steady cadence even as her pulse quickened. "Engine 2 oil pressure is dropping consistently. We're now in the caution range and trending downward." Rodriguez felt his stomach tighten as he confirmed the readings. This was exactly the kind of situation that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones, an emergency that developed gradually, giving them time to think but requiring decisive action before it became catastrophic. "How fast is it dropping?" he asked, already beginning to calculate their options. "Based on the rate of decline, we have maybe 20 to 30 minutes before we need to shut down the engine," Sarah replied, her hands already moving to pull up the emergency procedures on her electronic flight bag. "We need to start thinking about diversion airports. Denver is still 180 miles out, but Colorado Springs is about 90 miles northeast of our current position." It was at this moment that the true complexity of their situation became apparent. Rodriguez realized that while he held the title of captain on this flight, Sarah's experience and instincts were already proving invaluable. She had spotted the problem early, was already thinking several steps ahead, and her calm demeanor was exactly what they needed in a developing emergency. The institutional bias that had placed him in the left seat was about to be tested against the reality of aviation, where competence and quick thinking mattered far more than gender or politics. As Sarah began running through the engine failure checklists with methodical precision, she couldn't know that Colonel Webb had noticed the subtle change in engine sound that only a lifetime of flying could detect. His trained ear had picked up the almost imperceptible shift in the harmony of the twin engines, and his experienced eye had caught the slight adjustment in the aircraft's attitude as the pilots compensated for the developing problem. Webb sat quietly in his first-class seat, but every sense was alert, ready to act if needed. The hidden patch inside Sarah's jacket seemed to press against her heart as she worked through the emergency procedures. Soon, very soon, the circumstances that had earned her the right to wear that patch would prove more relevant than anyone aboard Flight 447 could possibly imagine. The skills, courage, and split-second judgment that the patch represented were about to be put to the ultimate test. And when they were, every person who had ever doubted her capabilities would understand exactly what it meant to have a true aviator at the controls. 15 minutes later, the situation aboard Flight 447 had deteriorated from concerning to critical. The oil pressure in Engine 2 had dropped into the red zone, and Sarah's calculations showed they had perhaps 10 minutes before complete engine failure became inevitable. But that wasn't the worst of it. As she monitored the weather radar ahead, her experienced eyes caught something that made her blood run cold. A massive storm system was moving rapidly across their intended diversion route to Colorado Springs, bringing with it severe turbulence, hail, and near-zero visibility conditions. "Rodriguez," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the cockpit's tense atmosphere, "we have a problem beyond the engine. Look at the weather picture ahead." She gestured to the radar display, where an ominous red and purple mass stretched across their path like a giant wall. "That storm system has intensified faster than the meteorologists predicted. Colorado Springs is completely socked in with severe weather, and it's moving east. Denver is still our best option, but we're going to be cutting it very close." Rodriguez felt sweat beating on his forehead as he absorbed the full gravity of their situation. Flying a commercial airliner on one engine was challenging, but manageable under normal conditions. Flying on one engine through severe weather while attempting a precision approach to Denver International Airport was the kind of scenario that filled aviation textbooks and haunted pilots' nightmares. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the radio to declare an emergency. "Denver Center, United 447 declaring an emergency. We have engine number 2 oil pressure in the red zone, anticipating engine shutdown within the next 10 minutes. Requesting vectors direct to Denver International and emergency equipment standing by." The air traffic controller's voice crackled back immediately, professional but urgent. "United 447, emergency declared, squawk 7700. Turn right heading 90, direct to Denver International. Emergency equipment will be standing by. Souls on board and fuel remaining." 147 souls on board, fuel sufficient for the approach with standard reserves, Rodriguez replied, but Sarah could hear the strain in his voice. She knew what he was thinking. Standard reserves assumed normal flight operations, not single-engine approaches in deteriorating weather conditions. It was at this crucial moment that Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She had been flying as first officer for 3 years since her promotion to captain, always deferring to the pilot in command, even when her experience exceeded theirs. But as she watched Rodriguez struggle with the radio communications while trying to manage the engine emergency, she realized that Flight 447 needed more than institutional hierarchy. It needed the best pilot available, regardless of the politics that had put her in the right seat. "Rodriguez," she said quietly but firmly, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully. 3 years ago, I wasn't just another airline pilot earning her stripes. I was Captain Sarah Mitchell, United States Air Force, flying combat search and rescue missions in Afghanistan." She paused, letting the words sink in. "The patch inside my jacket isn't a souvenir. It's a distinguished flying cross with 4 bronze stars. 4 separate missions, where I brought aircraft home under conditions that should have been impossible." Rodriguez's eyes widened as the implications hit him. He had heard of the Distinguished Flying Cross. It was awarded only for extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight, usually involving acts of heroism or extraordinary achievement. 4 bronze stars meant 4 separate acts of aerial heroism. The most relevant mission, Sarah continued, her hands never stopping their efficient movement across the instruments, was bringing home a damaged Black Hawk helicopter with a failed engine over the mountains of Afghanistan during a night rescue operation in severe weather. 17 Special Forces soldiers were depending on me to get them home, just like 147 passengers are depending on us right now. From his first-class seat, Colonel Webb had been listening to the subtle changes in engine sound and had noticed the flight attendants' increasingly frequent trips to the cockpit. His military-trained instincts told him something significant was happening. When he saw Maria Santos emerge from the cockpit with a pale face and immediately begin quietly briefing the other flight attendants, he knew they were facing a serious emergency. But what he couldn't have known was that the solution to their crisis was sitting in the right seat, wearing a patch that represented exactly the kind of heroism and expertise that the situation demanded. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued. "Rodriguez, I need you to make a decision. You can continue as pilot in command because that's what the airline assigned, or you can recognize that this aircraft and these passengers need the pilot with the most experience in exactly this type of emergency. Your choice, but choose quickly. We're running out of time and altitude." The moment stretched between them like the seconds before a lightning strike. Rodriguez looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and saw not the female pilot who had been relegated to first officer because of institutional bias, but a decorated combat veteran whose experience included successfully completing the exact type of mission they now faced. In that instant, the politics of the briefing room seemed not just irrelevant but dangerously absurd. "Take the aircraft, Captain," Rodriguez said, and for the first time that day he used her correct rank. "I'll handle communications and backup, you get us home." Sarah's hands moved to the controls with the smooth confidence of a surgeon picking up a scalpel. The aircraft seemed to respond differently under her touch, as if it too recognized that it was now in the hands of someone who had faced the impossible and won. As she began the delicate process of shutting down the failing engine while maintaining control in increasingly turbulent conditions, she felt the weight of the distinguished Flying Cross patch against her heart, not as a burden this time, but as a reminder of who she was and what she was capable of achieving when lives depended on her skill. With Engine 2 now completely shut down and secured, Flight 447 was flying on a single engine through increasingly violent turbulence as they approached the outer edge of the storm system. Sarah's hands moved across the controls with the fluid precision of someone who had performed similar maneuvers under enemy fire, but she knew this approach would test every skill she had ever acquired. Denver International Airport was still 60 miles away, and they were losing altitude faster than she had hoped. The mathematics of single-engine flight were unforgiving. Less power meant steeper descent angles, which meant less margin for error on the approach. "Denver Tower, United 447 Heavy, single-engine approach, requesting runway 16 right, the longest available." Sarah's voice came across the radio with calm authority that immediately caught the attention of everyone in the control tower. Air traffic controllers had heard thousands of emergency declarations, but there was something in this pilot's tone that spoke of absolute competence under pressure. "United 447 Heavy, cleared for ILS approach runway 16 right, winds 180 at 25, gusting to 40. Visibility 3 miles in moderate rain, emergency equipment standing by. Be advised, weather conditions deteriorating rapidly." As Sarah began the complex calculations for a single-engine approach in severe weather, something extraordinary happened in the passenger cabin. Colonel Webb, who had been quietly observing the flight attendants' increasingly urgent preparations, stood up and walked deliberately toward the cockpit. His military bearing and obvious confidence caused other passengers to take notice, and when he knocked firmly on the cockpit door, Maria Santos didn't hesitate to let him in. "I'm Colonel Marcus Webb, United States Air Force, retired," he announced as he stepped into the cockpit. 30 years of flying experience including test pilot and combat rescue operations. I heard the engine shut down from my seat, and I'm here to offer assistance if needed." His eyes immediately took in the instrument panel, the weather radar display, and the two pilots working with intense concentration. Sarah looked up briefly, her eyes meeting Webb's, and in that instant he saw something that made him step closer. The calm competence, the way her hands moved across the controls, the tactical thinking evident in her approach to the emergency. These weren't the skills of an ordinary airline pilot. These were the skills of someone who had flown in combat. "Colonel," Sarah said, never taking her primary attention away from flying the aircraft, "I'm Captain Sarah Mitchell. I flew combat search and rescue missions in Afghanistan, A-10 Warthogs and Black Hawks, Distinguished Flying Cross with 4 bronze stars." She paused as a particularly violent gust of wind buffeted the aircraft. "Right now we're executing what's essentially a combat approach, single engine, severe weather, minimal fuel reserves, and a window of opportunity that's closing fast." Webb's eyes widened with recognition and respect. He had heard of Captain Mitchell, the Air Force pilot who had become legendary for her impossible rescues in the mountains of Afghanistan. The pilot who had flown a damaged Black Hawk through a sandstorm to extract a pinned-down Special Forces unit. The pilot who had landed a battle-damaged A-10 on a highway after taking ground fire while protecting a convoy. And now she was here, in the right seat of a commercial airliner, fighting to save 147 civilian lives with the same skills that had saved countless soldiers. "What do you need, Captain?" Webb asked, and his use of her military rank carried with it all the respect and recognition that had been denied her that morning. "I need you to go back to the cabin and prepare the passengers," Sarah replied, her voice steady as she fought the controls through another bout of severe turbulence. "This is going to be a hard landing, harder than anything they've experienced on a commercial flight. Tell them to assume crash positions at my signal, but also tell them they're in the hands of someone who has never failed to bring her people home." As Webb headed back to the cabin, Sarah lined up for what would be the most challenging approach of her civilian flying career. The runway lights of Denver International appeared through the storm like a distant beacon of hope. But she knew the next 10 minutes would determine whether 147 people would walk away from this aircraft or become another aviation tragedy. With the aircraft bucking like an untamed horse in the violent crosswinds, Sarah's training took over completely. She became the pilot who had landed damaged aircraft in sandstorms, who had flown rescue missions that others said were impossible, who had earned her Distinguished Flying Cross not once but 4 times through acts of aerial heroism that pushed the boundaries of what humans and machines could achieve together. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." Sarah's voice came over the intercom with absolute authority. "We are beginning our final approach to Denver. I need everyone to assume crash positions now and hold them until we come to a complete stop. I want you to know that you are in experienced hands. My name is Captain Sarah Mitchell, and I have never failed to bring my people home safely." In the cabin, Colonel Webb stood up and addressed the passengers with his own commanding presence. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am Colonel Marcus Webb, United States Air Force. Your captain is one of the finest combat pilots I have ever encountered. She is a decorated war hero who has successfully completed missions that were deemed impossible. Trust in her skill, follow her instructions, and we will all walk off this aircraft together." As Flight 447 descended through the final 1,000 feet, buffeted by winds that would have grounded aircraft in normal circumstances, Sarah felt the familiar calm that had carried her through countless dangerous missions. The patch inside her jacket seemed to radiate warmth against her heart, not just a symbol of past achievements, but a promise of the heroism that lived within her, ready to emerge whenever lives depended on her skill and courage. The runway rushed up to meet them as Sarah executed a landing that would be talked about in aviation circles for years to come. A single-engine approach in severe weather conditions that demonstrated the very best of what human skill, training, and determination could achieve. When the wheels touched down and the aircraft rolled to a safe stop, the silence in the cabin lasted only a moment before it erupted in applause that seemed to shake the very airframe. As the emergency crews surrounded the aircraft and passengers began their evacuation, Captain Thompson appeared at the aircraft door. His face was pale as he realized the magnitude of what had just occurred and who had been responsible for saving every life aboard. Sarah stepped out of the cockpit, her uniform impeccable despite the stress of the emergency. And for the first time, she unzipped her jacket and showed him the distinguished flying cross patch that had been hidden inside. "Next time, Thompson," she said quietly, "maybe check a pilot's full qualifications before you decide who belongs in the captain's seat. These passengers got home safely today because I was exactly where I needed to be, doing exactly what I was trained to do." She paused, her eyes meeting his with unwavering confidence. Some patches speak louder than prejudice. Some skills matter more than politics, and some pilots earn their place in the cockpit through actions, not accommodation. As Sarah walked across the tarmac toward the terminal, Rodriguez caught up with her. "Captain," he said, and this time the title carried no awkwardness, only respect. "Thank you for showing me what real leadership looks like. I learned more in the last hour than I have in 15 years of flying." The story of Flight 447 would become aviation legend, not just as a remarkable feat of flying skill, but as a testament to the idea that true competence transcends all artificial barriers. Sarah Mitchell had finally found her voice, not through arguments or appeals to fairness, but through the simple, undeniable act of being exactly who she had always been. One of the finest pilots ever to take the controls of an aircraft, whose patch spoke louder than words because it represented deeds that no amount of bias could diminish.